Welcome to the Corporate Venturing Insider series. Today is going to be very, very special. We typically invite practitioners of corporate venturing, but here we are going to get someone who has been studying corporate venturing and who can give us context about the past, the present, what we would call modern CVCs, but also the future and what we should be hopeful, but also mindful about. Gary from London Business School, welcome.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. It's a pleasure to be here. This is one of my favorite series, and I'm happy to be here with you and your viewers.
Thank you. You're being very kind. Gary, do you mind maybe sharing your personal journey and what got you so interested about corporate venturing?
Good. So this is a great question, and it kind of made me reflect back on my childhood. I have a confession. It's between you, me, and maybe our viewers. And that is that I was a geek as a child. As 11-year-old, I would sit at home and write machine code and assembly code. I would write all kind of programs and softwares, and I would enjoy it a great deal. I would write software to write software and so on and so forth. And fast forward, I found myself in New York in the late 90s during the height of the dot-com bubble. This was a really exciting time. There's lots of money going around, lots of exciting innovation. There were all these venture capitalists, but equally, it was a very important moment for corporate VCs. There was an influx of corporate VCs going on there. And I was thinking about how can these corporate investors help geeks such as myself leverage themselves, maybe have a better go-to-market strategy or a better one, maybe align their technology with the corporate technology. And that's how I got interested in it. At the time, I was pursuing my PhD in New York. And so I was about to write a story of how corporates can work hand in hand with startups in order to drive everybody to a better place. Very soon I found out that the story is not as simple as that. And while at first I was disappointed that I don't have this good ending, this is basically what launched what I would think is actually quite a successful 20-year career studying corporate VCs. If you allow me, maybe one of the things that I've noticed, and that came out shortly after, we know that there was the dot-com and there was the burst of the dot-com. And this was a point where many corporations exited. And let's be honest, that didn't necessarily give a good name for corporations in terms of their persistence and so on and so forth. And to this day, you will find that people can have very strong feelings about corporates. I say it's a little bit like Mermite, this ubiquitous British spread that people either love or hate.
Yep.
And whenever I would have a conversation with a startup, with an investor, with a VC, they would come out with very strong feelings. I'm an academic. What I would like to do is actually take an evidence-based approach to it and see what does the data tell me. And so there might be cases where CVC does not work. But at the same time, there might be cases and structures where it works well. So rather than throwing the baby with the bathwater, what I would like to do is I would like to make sure that we have evidence-based, objective view on what's going on. And that allows you to have insights both about corporate venturing as well as many other strategies that corporate adopt these days to drive their innovations.
Very nice. I like the let's not throw the baby in the
with the bathwater. Yes.
That's actually something I will double click afterwards. But before that, maybe you can introduce yourself in terms of your studies and why you are such a reference for us.
Sure. So I've confessed to being a geek as a child. I then moved on to get various degrees in economics and finance. I have a PhD in strategy and finance, and I have been studying things that basically fall at that intersection of entrepreneurship, finance, and strategy. And corporate venture capital inevitably touches on all of these. So you can imagine that as a Venn diagram. business school professors love Venn diagrams.
Yes.
I got my degree in the US. I then moved on to become a faculty member at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania, where I'm still a senior fellow at the Mack Center for Technological Innovation. And over the last just over a decade, I've been a faculty member here at London Business School, which actually allows me to open my eyes and look at venturing not just in the US, but globally. And that might be something that we'll get to in a second. A lot of my academic work is around entrepreneurial finance and corporate venturing. I also do consulting and teaching within this space.
Very nice. And of course, you talked about the story did not have a good ending, but I'm hoping we get at the end of this interview that the ending is not ended. We actually should be hopeful about a very good ending. But let's start with the beginning. CVCs is not new. It's been going for decades. 1960s, I think, is where we start to have the first proof points of corporate venturing. Can you walk us through the past and what we should be learning from that past?
Sure. And so I think this is actually an excellent question, and it's always good to start at the beginning. And depending on the resources that you are looking at, many people kind of place the starting point of corporate venture capital in the 1960s. At that point in time, those of you who are history buffs might remember, in terms of corporate America, there was this big wave of conglomerate building these empires. It was partly fueled by the fact that companies started having a lot of cash flow. It was also partly driven by the fact that at that point in time, technological innovation and venture capital became more and more celebrated. The ARD, which is one of the first institutional VCs, started in the late 40s, and some of its offsprings have really kind of proven the venture capital model. And you started having corporations from Exxon and others investing in entrepreneurial ventures. By the way, some of them were internals, others were externals. This party went on up until the fuel crisis, the collapse of the market in the early 70s. At that point, we've basically seen many corporations rationalizing their activities, corporate venture capital being the casualty thereof. So that was arguably the first wave. Fast forward to the 80s, what we see is, again, another new wave of corporate venture capital. This was partly driven by various innovations. We've had digital equipment and other companies coming to fruition. We also seen a growth of the venture capital market. Those of your viewers who follow the venture capital industry, there's what's called the prudent man rule in 1979 that allowed pension funds to allocate a larger share of their asset, AUM, to risky projects, which unleashed money into VCs. Corporates followed suit. And again, 1987 was not a good year for the market, and have seen many corporates cease operations. So we have these excitement by the corporates, and soon there's a truncation. And most recently, relatively recently, the period where I lived in was the 1990s. You had the dot-com, but you also had some really exciting innovation on the hardware side with telecommunication, fiber optics, and so on and so forth. And you've seen entrance by VCs and corporations. And when the dot-com bubble has burst, we've seen many corporate exited. These are the waves. What I would like to maybe leave you with is two observations. One observation is that oftentimes these waves of corporate VCs have paralleled waves of technological innovation. We've seen a growth in certain technologies. In the 1990s, it was the telecommunication, routers, and so on and so forth. Cisco was a big investor of the time, Intel Capital, and others. And there are studies, including studies that I've conducted, basically showing that companies that engage in corporate venture capital have a higher patenting output than their industry peers. And the more corporate venture capital you engage in, the better, the more and the higher quality patenting you have. And this is, I think, an insight that has stayed with people. There is one element that I want to flag here, and that is it created this notion that CVC is a tool to gain a window on technology. And I think it is. But where I'd like to leave you with is that maybe there are other ways of using CVC. So that might be one observation. The second observation is the fact that CVCs were soon to exit. And we will probably talk about red flags at some point in time. It is true to understand that VCs who were at times left with some of the syndicate members out of the picture have developed some concerns about corporate investors. And one has to approach this heads on. Now, my motto, it doesn't mean that we need to throw the baby with the bathwater. Just because something didn't work out once doesn't mean that it will never work or that it's not fit for purpose in other situations.
Yeah, especially when the context is different. I like to always try to stress test what looks like correlation and causation. And let me ask the question maybe cheekily, because I do like the idea of CVCs will drive more innovation in corporations, but is there an argument to say that corporations that have CVCs already have the right mindset to create more innovations? And it may not be the CVC itself, but the CVC plus all the other corporate venturing tool set coming from that DNA of we want to explore and learn.
So this is an excellent question. And in fact, this is what kept my PhD not just 2 months, but 2 years, because you need to tackle this issue of endogeneity. Could it be that there's this latent variable? They're just more innovative and they both do more patents and they also do more CVC, but it's not the CVC that is driving the innovation activity. And this is where you do any number of things in order to do that, from actually talking to people and understanding how visibility into the startup ecosystem helps with driving innovation. And it can be because the startup you engage in are working on projects that allow you to become better. It can be because working around those startups actually makes you aware of other needs where you as a corporate have the capacity to push this forward. And it can be that working around startups can actually show you what doesn't work. And so you are more effective at realigning your internal R&D so that you have a better punch for the buck. And so talking to people, you get a sense of what are the underlying mechanisms. And then as a good academic and a commetrician, you also engage in various strategies in order to attempt to address what we call an endogeneity concern is. And there are certain things that you can do. You can actually create a synthetic of a company that, let's look at a company that's closest to you on R&D, leverage, and other parameters, but does not engage in CVC, and how do they play out. So there's several things that you can do. Controlling for all of that, we find that CVC is associated with greater patenting output. And I've articulated some of the mechanisms why that might play out.
Very nice. What I like also is that you're showing the benefit of a CVC also about not just where to go, but where not to go, and how this could realign the R&D. And I always like to say strategy is not about deciding what to do, it's deciding what not to do. Can you speak to the value of both, where the CVC can help knowing which direction should be considered versus the one that should not be considered?
Okay, and so this is what we would call a first best. So in an ideal world, for a corporate VC to be successful, it should be able to do both. In fact, if you think about it, what do we know about entrepreneurial ventures? Most of them fail. The big tragedy of any single startup is that when they fail, they fail. I think the big advantage for a corporate is that they can internalize those insights. They can actually use insights from one failure in order to realign or better calibrate their portfolio. And sometimes it's not even about outright failure. It's just about timing and the cadence of activities. To what extent do we believe that the shift to fiber optics will happen over the next 2 quarters versus over the next 5 years? Even that kind of insight. Do we see 50% of the market now operating on Android, or is it less than that, as we've heard a couple of days ago? It is that kind of insights that where you are on the market that allows you to be more effective with your own activities. And at the end of the day, we can be very sincere over here. A CVC of 100, 200, maybe even higher than that, even if they generate top-tier returns, might not move the needle on a large corporations. It is really those kind of insights, what to do, but also how to prioritize or where to avoid, that can be quite valuable from a corporate-wide perspective. That's where you start moving the needle. Now, I see that you're smiling because you both see the value of that and exercise it yourself, but also know how difficult it is to celebrate and learn from those failures. And there lies maybe some of the opportunities, but challenges to corporate venture capital.
I used to say that my ROI, what I'm expecting from our first fund was $50 million. I used to say my financial performance on that fund is $10 billion revenue increase for TDK. And this is really what you're getting at. Now, one thing that strike me from the past, so I want to also continue asking a few questions about the past, is when you are in crisis, you have two mechanisms. One is to shrink and one is to look for opportunities. And in the past, the CVCs have shrunk or stopped. But in the last 2 years and a half, with COVID and lockdowns and geopolitical issues and supply chain issues, we ended up with half of the active CVCs investing during this period being new CVCs. Can you speak to that contrast from the past where corporation would shrink versus now where they seems to be reacting to crisis in a positive way?
Well, I don't know if it's in a positive way, but it's spurring more corporate VCs. I think that a number of things are happening. I think that we need to take it in a context. I think the first one is that what this crisis did, and especially the last 2 years with COVID and everything else, as you've mentioned, have just made it so visible how digital disruption is upon us. And the fact that you need to engage with the digital disruption, the fact that some of these startups that were not on your radar screen on a day-to-day basis are now actually, clients are going to these startups. It's not just that annoying strategy head or CVC wannabe telling the board that we need to do that, but you have your business line telling you we are losing business to companies that were not on our radar screen before then. Those are startups, some of them. We see that in higher education, by the way. That gave a sense of urgency to many corporations, D2Cs in consumer goods, digital disruption and empowerment in fintech and otherwise. These have been very important. And then at the same time, what you see is an overall excitement, rejuvenation within the world of venture. We've seen bigger funds, but also what we've seen are emerging managers. And I'm sure that you've seen, it's not just that you have lots of new time CVCs, you actually have a lot of new time VCs, more than ever before. I think I've seen some stats that the last 2 years have seen more emerging managers, more new VCs than maybe the decade or two before that. And you have very bright people working within these corporations, so not with the VCs, but within corporations saying, actually, my friend or a person I know is setting up a venture fund. I think I can do so too. And so both that kind of urgency that you feel in the product market, as well as the benchmarking of individuals and the fact that, I don't know if to call them mid-level managers, but people who might not be at the board level, but people who drive strategy innovation, see that emerging managers can build new VCs. maybe we can also build a CVC. And taken together, that explains some of the resurgence of CVC.
I have to double click on this one, but do you see this massive number of emerging managers, VCs and CVCs, being a good thing? And it's actually, if we think about supply and demand, getting to an equilibrium? Or do you think we're overshooting and then we are going to see a return to a fewer number? What would you expect?
Well, if you ask me whether 100% of the emerging managers will be with us in 5 years' time, I think the answer is no. How do I calibrate it? It's difficult to say. What I would like to think is that one of the things that these emerging managers have done, they are a new path to introduce diversity along multiple dimensions. And so many times you see people, very successful people within a corporate setting saying, I had enough, I'm going to start my own venture. And when I ask them, can you explain to me, why would you leave a corporation that, put aside all the personal kind of benefits, but that has a footprint of clients across the world, that has the capacity to give you access to technical talent, that have the budgets? Why would you leave all that and go start on your own? They tell me the red tape, the bureaucracy, the working within the corporate shackles. To the extent that you take that logic, even though the venture capital community is embracing diversity, arguably this emerging manager path is an additional path that might introduce a dimension of diversity that might not be celebrated within some of the existing players. And so I think it has the potential of being a good effect. Time will tell whether we are just crowding out one type of funds from another, focusing on the same thing, or whether we are actually growing the pie.
And I'm hopeful because we will know indeed in 5 or 10 years if that works out. And I'm hopeful that this diversity of emerging managers will prove out to be very successful. Because if they are not, this is going to be the counterexample. But if they prove to be successful, then more and more limited partners and money will flow into this diversity and hopefully found really good entrepreneurs.
Let's revisit that in 3 to 5 years' time.
I will invite you again for that. Now, I want to close on the past with just one more question, which is, what do you think is the biggest learning that we haven't discussed already from the past as we move into the modern CVCs?
Well, I think that the discipline of having a continued presence in the market is probably that. Venture capital is not a short-term game; it's a long-term game. And as I tell my my students, the people I work with, and otherwise, it's not how well you do on this portfolio company; it's how do you do on the next portfolio you are aiming to build. And there's relationship and knowledge that's embedded in the community, and the need to be mindful of that and manage that, I think, is one of the key learnings, which in a way leads us to what the modern CVC might look like.
So please tell us how you observe today the modern CVCs. And it's not like it's monolithic. So correct. I want to hear from you how you see them and how you would categorize them even.
So I think that what we've seen over the last 2 decades has been a really break from the waves of the past. And I think if I think about it, there's like 4 characteristics that on which it differs. The first one is longevity, as the point that we've mentioned earlier. Yes, there are many new time CVCs, but as we just noted, there are also many new time VCs. And in fact, when you look at the relative ratios, it's not clear to me that there are more new CVCs than there are new VCs. Maybe more important, you now have many CVCs in terms of numbers that have been around not just for 2 years, not just for 5 years, for decades and more. in preparation for this call, I actually looked back at the keynote that I gave as part of the first or second Global Corporate Venturing meeting back in 2011. Very nice in the Emirates Stadium. And when I ran the number there, one of the things that was very clear to me was that corporate VCs, about 50% of them have been in play for 4 years or more. And that is actually quite important because the median tenure of a CEO is about that much. What that told me is that the olden day concern that corporate venturing is a CEO pet, change CEO, here goes the CVC, that is no longer the case. Corporate venture capital has earned a place as an important corporate function along others. And I'm happy to say that now many studies and many scholars, we have Elias Trubalov from Stanford and others, that are using that kind of surviving one or two CEOs as the yardstick for CVC longevity. And so we have players that have proven their ability to be in the full startup life cycle and maybe even over multiple funds. That's one. The second traits, I think, of the modern corporate investors is what I call, there's not just one objective, but there might be different reasons to engage in CVC. And I always give the following example. Every company I know, keep me honest over here, but every company you know would have a marketing function.
Yep.
But it is not the case that every company you know follows the same marketing strategy.
No.
They all have a marketing function, but they pursue different marketing strategies. And I know that in your own work and in some recent writings, you celebrate that. And the point I'm trying to make here is that there might be different ways of using corporate venture capital. And window on technology, if you remember, I've mentioned that there seems to be this strong correlation between patenting and CVC, and there was a strong logic of window on technology. And it is, again, it is to this day, a very important objective for corporate venture capital. But at the same time, and you said context change, in my own research, what I found out is that there are other important objectives for CVC. And I'm not talking about the financial one, which I'll put aside in a second. Another strategic logic for corporate venture capital may actually be orchestrating an ecosystem. And so it's not about finding that single bright star, that cutting edge technology that I want to connect to. It's actually about building a constellation. It's nurturing an ecosystem of innovative startups. And you see that NVIDIA doing that with their GPU venture that aims to build an ecosystem of people that operate on their GPU. You've seen that with Autodesk as they build it around their Spark network for 3D printing. It goes all the way to the Intel 64 fund that wanted to do that. And so there's another logic that sits next to window on technology, but is equally important. And then maybe finally, China is a world in and by itself, and maybe also by itself these days. But one of the things that we've done, and to the best of my knowledge, we are the first one, we've actually looked at corporate venture capital in China. Most academic studies I know of tend to focus on where the data is available, searching under the street lamp, if you wish. We spent 2 years building a database on corporate venture capital in China. And you know what we found? Just as a headline, when you operate in an economy that has a per capita growth in the double digits, percentage-wise, you can get venture-like J-curve returns simply by following something that is close to an ecosystem or a go-to-market strategy. And so you have these different types of CVC objectives. And I think the burden upon us is to make sure that when we select our CVC model, we select the one that will be relevant for us. So I talked a lot about longevity. I talked a lot about multiple objectives. I think the other thing that is quite important is just the sheer prevalence of corporate venture capital. It used to be an ICT play, okay, a telecommunication kind of play, and there was always the pharmaceuticals that were doing it on the side. I think these days, if you throw a stone, you'll hit a CVC. And it doesn't matter if it's in consumer goods, if it's in food, if it is in transportation. Name the industry, and you'll find not just one, not just two, but a plethora of corporate investors. And to me, what that means is that A, we need to better understand it because it accounts, PitchBook, I think they place it at about 25% of all venture deals are by corporates. And that's not just a single industry, that's, as we've talked about, it's across industries. So these are longevity, the multiple different objectives, the prevalence of it. And then finally, and depending on the time I can go into it or not, there's reasons to believe that corporate venture capital not only help the parent corporation, but also play an important and a positive impact on startups. And I can share some studies I've done there, but those are the four features of the modern day CVC: the longevity, the multiple objectives, the prevalence, and the benefits to the parent and the startups.
Very nice. I'll definitively ask you about the positive impact to startups, but before that, I like your analogy of a marketing department and they act differently. I'm actually pushing this beyond that, where I think every CVC is like a startup. They have their own strategies, they have their own why. And from that, if they are well designed, they are going to actually match the why with their design and how they approach corporate venturing. And that's also why we do this interview series. We want to see many practitioners practicing differently depending on their why, their mission, their goal. Would you say that most of the CVCs today have a clear understanding about their why? And what was a pitfall you've seen on them defining their why and matching their design?
Now
it's a loaded question.
now we're stepping to the world of pain. So I think one of the reasons I enjoy having this conversation with you in particular is that rather than selling my way of CVC, you actually embrace and advocate the fact that there might be different way. Frank Sinatra used to say, "I did it my way," and your way might be different than my way. I literally remember a consulting job when the team came to me and they had done a great. They would get an A+ on a case study on what used to be a very prominent CVC at the time, and they really have done their all research. They've done it very well. And said, "We want that." I asked a single question, like, what other part of that company's strategy do you follow in marketing, in R&D, in go-to-market? They said, well, none. They are completely different. and so, but why do you think that you need to copy their corporate venture capital structure? And so I think that it's completely the single most important thing is to do what you said. Start with the why. And the moment you understand that corporate venture capital might be driven by a window on technology logic, but equally so by an ecosystem orchestrating logic, or by any one of other objectives, it frees you up. It gives you what I say, a license to dream. You don't need to do what, let's not name names, but what the prolific one that's been in the news recently does, but what is right for your corporation. Where the challenge comes is then you need to put a design that follows suit. And it's easier said than done. When I think about design, I think along a few dimensions. One dimension is the structure. And the structure encapsulates in it any number of things, from the structure of the investment committee, how do you access funds, is it a one-off from treasury, is it a segregated one, and so on and so forth. I think about staffing. I think about the personnel, who's driving that. I still remember where I had this really exciting a company coming to me, and they wanted to set up a corporate venturing arm to invest in technologies that will disrupt the industry in 5 to 7 years' time.
Mm-hmm.
The person leading that was a veteran of the corporation, have managed a couple of business units, and was due to retire within 2 years.
Oh, there's no issues here, right?
Thinking about who are the people who will drive that? What is their background? Is it from corporate? Is it from venture capital? Is it elsewhere? In some of the studies that I've done, I've kind of identified the funnel of who comes into corporate venture capital. At least back in that time, it was about a third corporate insiders, a third VCs, and about a third from consulting or supporting dimension. And that is changing ever since. And then finally, extremely important, but oftentimes so contentious that you don't even mention, is how do you incentivize the team? And so what we do know, and that's kind of, if I've alluded at the beginning, the moment you understand corporate venture capital is the moment you have insights into all the dynamics that affect any innovation and change within organization. CVC is like all that on steroids. We know that innovation follows a parallel distribution. Many fail and a few succeed. Compensation in the world of venture follows that through carried interest. That is a concept that is very difficult to accept within the world of corporation. I have a few hobbies. One of them is newspaper clips, where there's an article, level 3 in the corporation made 2 times the money earned by all C-suite combined. How many corporations can live with something like that? I can tell you that in one of the studies that I've done, I've yet to look at that with the full econometrics, but one of the things that determined whether a corporation will introduce high power incentives that are similar to that of the VC, guess what was that? I'm not gonna make you guess. It was distance from the headquarters. So if you drive into the same parking lot as everyone else, and they see your beautiful, I don't know what's your favorite car these days, but you're driving that 7-figure car, everybody else is driving their Priuses, very difficult to accept that within organization. It so happened that corporations that happen to have their corporates historically, let's say in the Midwest, but the CVC unit was in California, so there wasn't that physical proximity. Those were the ones that were more likely to actually have high power incentives. So it wasn't derived from the why, it wasn't strategic, it was just a matter of corporate reality, political reality that I'm sure we can all relate to. I think where my analysis was quite telling was, once you control for the CVC stated objective and some of their design choices, what actually drove their investment practices was the compensation structure. And so to me, what that tells, just to kind of use it again, you should be deriving your structure, staffing, and compensation from your why. But at least the compensation is a very loaded question. Various studies suggest that less than 2/3 have any form of kind of high-powered incentives, and that at least in the studies that I've done, is actually correlated with investment practices, and you need to find a way of bringing those together.
It's very interesting. And so maybe here I will challenge a little bit, because we talk about the power law, which is a fact in a way, or rule of the nature. But depending on the why, let's say that the why is about enabling an ecosystem of partners around Intel or NVIDIA or Salesforce, then the power law is not as strong as it could be if you're exploring the disruption from 5 years or 10 years from now. And so the compensation, I'm assuming, would be different whether you're trying to enable an ecosystem and you have much more certainty and inside knowledge and ability to influence the outcome of the startup versus those who are much more long-term bets. How do you see these differences?
I think that you are completely on the right track. But what you've just articulated is the need to have thoughtful design going into that. High power incentives might be relevant under certain whys and might actually be less relevant under different whys. And so I think that's exactly the point of consideration. Where I would argue that there's been some challenges is that when we look at how do I can have from my own experience, the companies I studied or the companies I worked with, how do they actually approach the design of a corporate VC? In one of two ways. The first one is what I call mimetic isomorphism, which is a very loaded academic terms to say copy-paste. There's been a certain CVC in the news or a certain CVC that my business school buddy is running, and I copy-paste what they've done. I mimic them. This is where the mimetic isomorphism comes from. That's one way. And so I tend to build a CVC that I have a template for, irrespective of whether it's appropriate for my organization.
Yeah.
The second element that affects a lot of efforts to build a CVC has to do with stakeholder management. I don't need to tell you, and anyone here who has attempted structuring a CVC, that there are many stakeholders within the organization you need to manage. And everybody wants the well-being of the overall corporation, or at least one would hope for. But they have very different views on what that entails. And in the process of going through approval at the various level and ultimately the board level, you might end up with a structure that satisfies those different demands, but doesn't necessarily achieve that alignment that you are advocating. And so these are red flags, or these are the realities that many corporate VCs go through. And what you need to do is you need to have the presence of mind, in the moral support. Sometimes for me as an academic, having objective data does that. So having studies such as the one I've talked to you earlier gives me that comfort to say, I see where you're coming from, I understand what you're saying, but if you subscribe the same as I do from the why, we need to break from corporate convention and actually make a change over here.
And that is, for me, a golden nugget, which is, if you're clear about the why and you propose a design, you need to stick to your guns and make sure that what's linked to that why doesn't change. And if not, you might actually cripple the CVC even before it gets started. And it's not like once you get started with a wrong track, it's going to be easy to fix afterwards. If anything, it's much, much harder. What's your view about managing the stakeholders in a way where you can be soft in some places, but firm on the ones that matter? Do you have any guidance from what you've observed?
I wish there was an easy way to do that. And this is where I've been in those rooms and I've tried to think together and help teams as they're trying to structure that. I think the first one is to be mindful that, and it goes back to the fact that there are multiple objectives and structures that support them, to recognize that there's this variation, there is this diversity. The moment you realize that there isn't the right way to do it, but there are different ways of doing it, this is where the marketing analogy. Everybody has a marketing strategy, but it's not the case that everybody has the same marketing the same marketing function, but they don't have the same marketing strategy. I think that is something that I found people resonate with. The other thing that you want to do
about license to dream, which I think is so important to stress.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And then the other thing is you want to come with evidence. You want to come with the data, and to what extent is that structure correlated with what you're trying to achieve, to what extent it isn't. And I think by now, between reports that have been published, insights through the Corporate Venturing Insider, in academic work that is out there, we have this kind of research. Now, sometimes you might find, and I've been in that position, somebody wants to create a certain structure, and actually the evidence that I look at will tell me that doesn't make sense. So you need to be able to be the first one that accept it. But if you come with conviction, backed by data, and armed by this license to dream, I think you have a good fighting chance.
Very nice. So let's move toward the future. And I think you're setting the perfect scene to explain how we should embrace this plurality. Let's start with maybe what could be the red flags, and then we'll talk about all the goodness, including what you talked about the positive impact for entrepreneurs that can even scale. But let's start with the red flags. What would you say you see for the future?
Okay, so and this might be this would not be me drinking the Kool-Aid, but this would be me doubling down on not to throw the baby with the bathwater. Will we have with us 100% of the corporate VCs that have been launched over the last 2 years? Probably not. But will we have 100% of the emerging managers that have started over the last 2 years? Probably not. And that statement is true to will we have 100% of the marketing strategies that have been innovated during COVID with us? Probably not. What you don't want to do is you don't want to say that corporate venture capital is not legit or doesn't have a room to play. And I think historically, given the boom and bust, and given that it was a little bit more of a foreign experience, that was the takeaway. Where I'm hopeful, I'm quite hopeful, is that we understand now that engaging the ecosystem of entrepreneurial venture is important. Is important for multiple reasons. And so to completely eliminate that is probably not going to happen. Where one could be hopeful is that what that tells you is that rather than make it a switch on, switch off, you need to take a hard look at how do I structure it. And one of the things that we've seen, and we've seen along the long-lasting corporate VCs, is that they change, they evolve, they morph. Their objectives, their structure, the way they play is not necessarily been what it has been 21 years ago, 27 years ago. The context changed, the corporate change, and the corporate VC changes with it. And this is if you allow me, I kind of say that whenever I engage in a conversation, there are usually 2 points in time. It is either that 6 to 3 months before launching the corporate VC, as one try to think about what would be the structure, and it's 3 to 5 years after launching the CVC, as one think about, okay, what do life look like as 2.0, as 3.0? And each one of them involves an existential crisis of sort. And this is where you need to manage. Where I'm hopeful for is that people will take this advice. Where the red flags are ignoring it, are thinking that just because I've been underwritten for the first 2 years, I'll be continued to be underwritten for the next 3 years. Just because venture was successful in 2020 or popular in 2020, it will continue to be so in 2023. I think that's where some of the red flags come from.
Okay, I'm going to ask for more red flags.
More red flags. So I think the first one is when I talked about earlier, I talked about how you want to think about structure for, say, investment committee, or you want to think about people, who are the people there, or you want to think about compensation, how do you compensate them? Oftentimes I see decks that really do sample best practices along each one of these dimensions. But unfortunately, they are not aligned along the dimensions. So, by analogy, you can have the best sports shoes on, but if you are then dressed in a tuxedo, you're probably not going to win that race, okay?
Even though you look great.
You look well. Let's put that on the side. But you need to have that alignment. What can look like best practice on any single dimension doesn't guarantee that as a whole you're aligned. And increasingly, I have engaged with many thoughtful people that can understand why certain dimensions are important. Sometimes they say, I was able to pitch my point on investment committee structure and the team I need. I'm going to have to cede on compensation. I'll let that one go. It doesn't work that way. If you want to think about it from kind of basic combinatorics, if you need three things to work, and the first one you have structured so you have 90% fighting chance, and the second one you structured so that you have 90% fighting chance, but then the last one you've seeded on, so you only have 10% fighting chance. Your fighting chance is a function of the 90 times 90 times 10%. You're diluting yourself from the get-go. And it's very easy to, if you just have a little bit of insight, to go in and say, guys, let's just think that through. Let's see what that does to us. So this is not just each component by itself, but the alignment is another one.
It's a golden nugget because it's actually hundreds of design decisions for each CVC. And what matters is not trying to maximize each, but that alignment that becomes harmonious. And from experience, this is really, really hard. And this is where you always have to go back to the why to explain why it makes sense.
Yeah, and you're saying it with a smile on your face, but I know the amount of agony that yourself and many others have had. So kudos for you to making it stick. And then if I go back to the, we're talking a lot from a point of view of designing from scratch, as if you have tabula rasa and you're designing it. The same challenge comes to you in year 3 or 4, where let's say you're not being terminated, but people actually suggest that why won't you take on this, and that? And sometimes it's great, but other times it can actually lead to dilution of what you're trying to do. And you need to be very clear about it. Should it all live under a single structure? Maybe it actually needs to follow different structures. You need to have the presence of mind and perseverance to again understand how you best align yourself to win on everyone. And KPIs that might be relevant for ecosystem building might not be relevant for window on technology. But if you try to now put both objectives, because you've been asked to in year 3, you try to now make them, you already know from the get-go that you're going to dilute your traction on any single KPI.
Yeah, I mean, from experience, every single year, I will get suggestions, let's call them suggestions, to change a few parameters. But it's a system. You have to look at all the design decisions and make sure it relates to the why. But for the person suggesting, they think, oh, it's an obvious improvement. But the parameters are linked to each other. And so you have to really think about the why behind the suggestion and relate that to the why of the organization as well as the CVC. So I think what you're describing is resonating very strongly. Now, I want to ask about this positive impact to startups, because that's also a place where we should be so hopeful and even ambitious.
So I think the first and foremost is that it's incumbent upon us to understand what is the impact on startup. And let me be very sincere. Some of my earlier work on CVC was informed by the fact that there are challenges. One of the first quotes I had from a founder who told me it's very difficult for me to open the kimono to a team that has all the technical stuff. Well, they have 10 times the technical stuff that I do, and share those insights with me. And I think this is where working with CVCs that have longevities, that have proven their ability to manage this relationship in a meaningful way, not just with one startup, but with multiple, is quite important. They build a rapport, reputation that we talked about earlier. So there are challenges, but there are also opportunities. If nothing else, we know or we've been told that capital is a commodity. Well, you know what? Corporate investors have been a type of investors that bring more than just capital.
Yeah.
They bring many, many other things. And so this has kind of been lost maybe in the argument, but we have had for the last, 10 years now, a big push to what we see applied VCs or platform VCs, where you don't just have the investment team, but you have a hot desk of a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen people who are operational people who help the startups. The corporate has 10,000 people. And so I think that when you realize that there are on marketing, on market access, on technology, on regulatory know-how, you have lots of benefits in the corporate has a potential. Whether the corporate team knows how to realize that, that's one of those red flags, and we can go down that rabbit hole. But I think the corporate has a lot of potential there. And then one of the things that I've done is I've looked at the world of biotechnology, where even historically you had a large number of corporates compared to all VCs. For various reasons of long time horizons and otherwise, you've actually seen, at least during the 90s and 2000s, the relative weight of VC dropping and the relative weight of CVC increasing. And the question I ask myself is, it's great that we get money from corporate as opposed to independent VCs, but is it good for the startups?
Exactly.
And I've looked at that, and this is a study that's been published in Nature Biotechnology and in a companion piece in another academic journal. What we find is that startups, biotech startups, we looked at the universe, 600 in the 90s and 2000, those that receive corporate backing are more likely to be innovative. So at the time of investment, they are more likely to have more patents and more scientific publication compared to their age group. Maybe more interestingly, when we look at what happened from the moment they got the investment 4 years out, what we find is that those that have been backed only by VCs, about 14% of them are likely to turn from innovation laggards, so they lag on patenting and publication, to innovation leaders. 14%. Those backed by corporates, they have 27% chance.
That's a big jump.
That's a big jump. And when we talk to people, one of the things that we see is simple stuff. I don't know if it's simple or not. Where do I buy a spectrometer? Where do I buy a spectrometer? When you have the team in a corporate that can get you there, maybe can get it faster to you, maybe can get you the right one, that advice can be very, very helpful.
Yes.
Sometimes it's even outside the technological realm and elsewhere. For you to be successful, especially in biotech, there's a whole regulatory layer. Well, the corporate has a regulatory team, not just with know-how, but with relationships with FDA and other authorities. Any VC will probably have great insights, but cannot replicate that team of 200 people with know-how, with relationship, with processes. And so you start getting a sense of why is it that if works well, a corporate can be an important source of advantage for startups. It doesn't always materialize, but you can see where the potential comes from.
Absolutely. So I would like to end this interview in the way it would be most beneficial for the audience who are thinking about starting a CVC. And I know you have tough questions you ask to them when you meet them one-to-one. What are your top 3 tough questions for them to think through?
Excellent. So the first one is I ask them why. And I don't ask them why from a corporate, and don't give me the deck. I'm talking to you, Jane. I'm talking to you, Joe. Why? Why do you want to set up a CVC unit? And I think that is actually quite important because, as we said, for at least certain types of CVCs, the payoff will not be realized in 2 quarters, maybe not even 2 years. And the moment you understand that is the moment that you understand whether you personally want to embark on this mission. So Jane, Joe, why do you engage with it? Once we've accomplished that, I only then turn to everything that we've talked about earlier, which would be the second and third point. Why do you think your organization should engage with that? And that shouldn't be because of this mimetic isomorphism. Our body has done that, our competitor has done that. Why do you think there's that? And then the moment that we do that, we get into the design, As you said yourself, there are hundreds of decisions that go into that. Just how do you structure the IC? How do you build the staff? What credentials? And so you get to that. But you start with the personal why, only then goes to the organizational why, and then start with designing the entity.
Wow. Gary, this was a fantastic interview. Thank you for sharing not a practitioner view, but actually an observer that actually can articulate and dissect all of this for us. Thank you very much, Gary.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. It's been a pleasure, and I'm glad you found it useful.